Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. My guest today is the MP for New Brunswick Southwest, John Williamson. Thank you for being here today, John.
It's my pleasure. It's good to be back. What are we, mid-March? It's been a long couple weeks in Parliament between the Emergencies Act and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've been going full out, and of course things back home continue with local files as well. So wow. Busy but good.
I was going to say, you were here just on this couch 3 weeks ago, and we were talking about the historic convoy.
Yes.
And 3 weeks later, we're talking about a war that at the time I know was on the radar somewhat, but not to the degree we're experiencing now.
No, well, Putin has made good on his statements over the last decade about Ukraine, and has rolled in more than 100,000 troops to try to take over and occupy Ukraine. So it is a terrible situation, and we can all see the devastation that is being brought down on Ukraine. And of course, we've got the biggest number of refugees in Europe since the Second World War. So and the loss of innocent life. It's terrible.
Mm-hmm. Are the sanctions that Canada is a part of imposing, are they enough, or should we be doing more? I know that you've just given a speech in Parliament on this subject.
So look, I think the government of Canada is off to a good start working with our European and American allies. I think the sanctions are tough, and they're going to take they're going to have an economic bite on Russia and the Russian people as well. The problem is, and I said this in the House of Commons, sanctions don't win wars. I mean, look, we've had sanctions on Venezuela now for 2 decades, and while it's impoverished the country and made life very difficult for the leadership there, and as well as the people, it has not brought about a change or freedoms. And the Ukrainians are certainly putting up a ferocious fight, and I think they've surprised not only the Russians but the world with their determination. It's going to take arms. It's going to take support for Ukraine, and Canada's been part of that. Not only has the Prime Minister committed aid's been delivered as well, both humanitarian and military aid, and that's how the Russians are going to be beaten. It's not going to be through sanctions, because it's a big country. China's supporting Russia indirectly, so it's going to come down to the battlefield. And I think we'd all hope we wouldn't see something like this again, but we are in Europe, and it's shocking, it's discouraging, and all we can do now is face up to it.
Mm-hmm. President Zelensky's been asking for a no-fly zone. There is fear, though, that if doing that, it could cause Putin to see NATO in particular seeing this as a world war. What's the feeling in Ottawa on this topic?
Well, I think that's the general consensus is, right now you've got Russians fighting Ukrainian soldiers and civil defense. If you start putting up either NATO soldiers into Ukraine or NATO warplanes into Ukraine, you now have effectively Russians fighting with Americans and their allies, and that of course then potentially expands the war into other parts of Europe. My wife Kelly right now is in Latvia. The Prime Minister's there today with the Chief of Defense Staff and the Defense Minister to reassure their allies that as NATO members we'll be there for them. But we need to be very, very careful about broadening this war, because Europe does have a history of conflicts begin locally and they expand very, very quickly, and that could have immense repercussions not only on Europe but the whole world community. So I tend to agree right now. It's heartbreaking to see when Ukrainians are being killed indiscriminately, but I think right now the decision not to send in warplanes is the right decision, not to put in place a no-fly zone, because that would have Americans shooting Russians and Russians shooting Americans, and then potentially Russians shooting at American air bases in Europe, and who knows where it ends.
Mm-hmm. I never thought I'd be asking this on this show, but should we be fearing nuclear war? I know Putin said he sees the sanctions as a declaration of war already.
Yeah, so look, I I tend to think Putin is a rational actor. I don't subscribe to the notion that he is crazy. He might be wrong. I think he is a vicious dictator, but I do think he is acting rationally. In fact, he's telegraphed this for 15 years that he was going to move on Ukraine at some point. Some people chose not to hear. Some people chose to ignore it. But I don't think that is part of his plan. Look, I'm just old enough to have to be aware of the tail end of the Cold War and the threat we lived under with the Soviets and the mutual assured discussion, to know how it will impact people just being aware that there is the remote possibility. And it's not something that I am concerned about, but we need to be on guard that mistakes don't happen. The Americans are now communicating directly with the Russian military as a way just to make sure that miscommunication doesn't happen. That's why I think countries, NATO and our allies, have to be careful about getting into a direct conflict with Russians. Look, and I say that I am outraged by what the Russians have done. I am cheering for the Ukrainians, and I am for providing them with whatever it takes to push back, repel, defeat the Russian army. But I think we need to be very careful we don't extend this war and engulf more of Europe into this.
A lot of us watching here in Canada, there's a sense of helplessness, and I'm sure that you get questions that you're asked, but we get them here about how people want to know how they can help, and obviously taking in refugees could be a way.
Yeah.
How long a process is that going to be? Has it been expedited so that we can get Ukrainian refugees?
So not yet, but I think the federal government will make some announcements the next couple of weeks. And I think there's going to be the need is going to be there. And just like Canada helped in 1956 when Hungarians looked to move to the West after the Soviets occupied Hungary, I think we're going to see that happen again today with Ukrainians. And I believe Canada will step up and play a role. I think for many Ukrainians, this will be a temporary move. But that assumes that things end in Ukraine. We can see on television and on our smartphones that parts of that country are being destroyed, and there's going to be a real rebuilding after. But we're not even at that stage yet. We're still trying to figure this all out. But I think there will be an opportunity. I think we're going to have to bear. This is not going to be easy for everyone, but I think energy prices are going to stay high. That's going to impact working families, people on modest incomes in particular. That is one way I think that North Americans are going to sacrifice a little bit. Canada's already moved to prohibit crude and petroleum products from Russia. That's not a big sacrifice because we don't import very much. America's now talking about it. That's a bigger sacrifice for them, but still manageable. But the problem is Europe. Europe is energy dependent on Russia, which means they are both funding this war, but they're also in a weakened position because the Russians could cut off oil and gas to Europe and cause problems there as well. So we need to, I think, as Canadians, think about how we can use our energy resources to help Europe get off that dependency.
Obviously, the first economic feeling in this part of the world is gas prices. I think today it was $1.80 a liter, which I think in my lifetime is the most I've ever seen it, which will trickle down into food costs and whatnot. Are there discussions right now? I know pipelines have always been on the radar, can be controversial, but are there discussions renewed on these ventures?
Well, there is, both in Canada and the United States. Look, these are policy decisions. And look, I want to say up front, I think the Prime Minister has responded well to the crisis in Ukraine. And our support for him goes to the, overseas. We're one team, and we're going to do what we can to help Ukraine. Domestically, both the Trudeau government and the Biden administration have made policy decisions that have not helped our situation. If we had a pipeline to the refinery in St. John, Canada would be in a position to provide more of its energy to Europe. And if Joe Biden hadn't canceled the Keystone XL, there could be enough oil flowing from Alberta to completely offset what America buys today from Russia. So these are the kind of tough questions we're going to have to answer as a country. I think we've already seen a change in approach in Germany, where the new German chancellor, has basically thrown out his predecessor's approach to Russia, which was to buy energy. They've now committed to increasing their military budget to the 2% of GDP, which is the NATO minimum, which they'd long resisted. And so I think we're going to see more of these discussions about dealing with a much more hostile Russia, a Russia that doesn't respond to sanctions, and a Russia that doesn't respect borders. And Canada has a concern here as well, because our northern territory, between the Russians and us is the Arctic. And while we don't share a border directly with Russia, the Russian leader has in the last number of years claimed part of Canada's north as Russian territory under the Arctic Ocean, the seabed. So we've got tough questions at home to answer in terms of NORAD's readiness and our ability to patrol our ocean. Russia has 40 icebreakers that can patrol year-round. We have one that can barely do it 12 months of the year. So we need to be thinking about how we're going to ensure that our coastline is secure and we're able to protect our interest in the north, because right now we're not in a position to do that. And I should say on the side, China, which has no bearing on the Arctic, is also building part of its navy to be able to patrol in the Arctic as well. So there's some challenges coming to Canada that are going to require decisions in our parliament as well as in the U.S. Congress.
I actually remember you saying that in your speech on Parliament, and it was actually a fact that I hadn't considered. The 40 vessels and us having one.
Barely. Yeah. We can patrol year round, but not on a sustained basis. It's a challenge to get there. As well, the NORAD air defense system that Canada shares with the United States needs an upgrade as well. I was on the Defense Committee in my first Parliament. It was a problem then. Very little has been done, and that is a huge price tag because with Russia's ability to project its power, we need to be in a position where we can monitor the skies and be able to respond to that.
Obviously, it feels like, I think after 2 years of a pandemic, and then the convoy here to moving, transitioning into this, it can be overwhelming and definitely feels like a bigger attack on democracy as a whole.
I think it is. I think we had in the last number of decades we had not that we've gotten used to. I think we had reaped the benefits of peace and democracy, and we had taken our eye off the ball in terms of some of the threats that are out there. Because if you look at what the Russians are saying vis-a-vis Ukraine, it's not a really real country. These people are really Russians. They just don't know it. That is very similar to what Beijing says about Taiwan. Taiwan, which is a self-governing island of 20-some million people, which has never been under the government of the communists in China. But Beijing has the same line that this really isn't a country. These people really are our people, as a way to legitimize a future invasion. And again, like Putin, Xi, the dictator in China, has also telegraphed mainland China's desire to retake Taiwan. So we're in a state now where some of the assumptions we've had since the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think we're going to have to reassess. Now the good news is, maybe we'll end on some good news, is the invasion of Ukraine has united the West. I don't think Putin expected both the Ukrainians to respond as they did, or for Europe and even Joe Biden to respond. It's united NATO, it's united Europe. Europeans are now, as I said, they're prepared to spend more in their defense, and Biden has kept this alliance together. He has worked with our European allies to make sure, as well as with Canada, to make sure that all the allied countries are on the same page, and that I think has been a positive development, because it shows that when we're up against the wall, our way of life matters, our freedoms matters, and we're prepared to act in concert to protect them.
Yes, I'll have to have you back to talk about this topic soon, because I think it does feel like what's coming next, we don't know. And as you mentioned, China, we wonder if China's looking to this situation to decide what to do when it comes to Taiwan. It's scary, and I think everyone's going to bed a little bit overwhelmed every night. But to shift to some positive news, you're now chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
Yes.
Can you tell me what exactly that means and what your role will be?
So I'm the chairman of this parliamentary committee, and that is, I consider it an honor. First of all, generally it's government MPs that chair parliamentary committees, but there are a handful of committees in Parliament that when they were established, opposition MPs were given the chairmanship of these committees to ensure a little more independence from the government. And what public accounts does is it reviews two things. It reviews how government has spent money. So we don't look at the budget and projections and the policy. We actually look at, did the government do what it said it was going to do, and how did they spend that money? And twinned with that, we spend a lot of time both working with the Auditor General of Canada and the reports that office produces. And what that office does is they go right in and assess how tax dollars were spent. So the committee's job is to review those reports, to hear from top government officials to determine why money wasn't spent well, and what steps are being taken to ensure that in the future tax dollars will be spent better. And so I'm pleased with this, because long before I was an elected official, I headed a group called the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, going back 15 years now at least. And in that role, I spent a lot of time studying the public accounts to see how government was spending and reviewing the Auditor General report. So this is a bit of a homecoming for me. I'm excited about the new role. As the chair, I'm neutral in deliberations. I will be guided by the committee in terms of what we study. But I will have a hand in witnesses and guiding things. And it's my belief that the rights of members of Parliament and the public to learn these answers is not something that's granted by government. It is a right that we have as Canadians and as parliamentarians, and I will ensure that we use those privileges we have to the fullest extent possible when we see things are happening that shouldn't happen.
Well, I also wanted to ask you a little bit about, and this will probably be something that in a few weeks' time I'll have to have you back again, the testing requirements at the border.
Oh, yes.
Obviously in Southwest New Brunswick, with so many of us having ties to Maine,
Yeah.
There's a lot of desire to go over.
Yeah.
I imagine you get way more messages than I do, and I get them every day from people asking questions. Now, the PCR test requirement, it's not that it's dropped. We're now allowed to have an antigen test in its place, but it has to be clinically administered, which means it's not the home test, so it is more complicated.
Yeah.
Is there any sense in Ottawa that this might be dropped soon as a requirement, especially with a lot of vaccination mandates province-wide?
So I'm not picking that up yet from the federal government. But having said that, I think there is a ton of frustration out across the country, and I don't know. Like, I'd like to give some hope here. Right now, I don't see it there. As of March 1st, the government actually took a step backwards. In that, if a Canadian shows up in Calais with a positive test and says, "Well, I want to come home and self-isolate," which Canadians can do for the last 2 years, that's no longer allowed. The choice is, if you insist on coming home, you could be fined $5,000 per person. And what the government wants Canadians to do is stay out of the country for another 10 days. Now, I view that as outrageous. It is using a financial hammer to deny a constitutional right for Canadians to come home anytime to their country. And for 2 years, it has worked. People come home and they self-isolate for 2 weeks, and it has worked well. And the government, for whatever reason, has removed that option. So I feel, in fact, the Liberals are going backwards on this. At a time when these restrictions should be melting away, they're actually making it more difficult. Because even this, going from a PCR test to the rapid test 24 hours in advance, isn't a great solution if you live in a border community. Because it's still a big hindrance and separates families in friends. And what I've noticed in the last couple of months is that more and more Canadians believe we have to learn to live with COVID, which means testing, but also means opening up again. And we're seeing here in the province, in a week from today, masks won't be required. Now, I think a lot of people are still going to wear masks, and that's their right to do so as Canadians. But we're seeing these restrictions melt away at the provincial level and around the world. I'd like to see it happen at the border. It's an issue that I'm going to keep pushing in Parliament, because I think the Liberals are on the wrong side of this. There's no science to back this up, and I don't think there's a lot of public support for what they're doing now on the borders.
Okay, well, I will have to have you back to get another update
For
soon,
sure.
because it's probably one of the questions we get the most questions about.
Yeah.
On a more hyper-local level, Grand Manan, we know, is losing their bank this summer. Their only bank on the island, it's the Scotia Bank. Consolidating with St. George, but as we know, is a really far ferry ride. Any idea on what's going on? Have you heard from?
Well, I mean, I know exactly what's going on. The Scotia Bank is pulling out, and their solution is to send their clients to St. George, which isn't a solution. Anyone that knows the island knows that those communities, while they might look close on a map, when folks leave Grand Manan, they tend to St. John, tend to go to St. John, or they go to Browns Flat in the summer, and other places. People don't go to St. George from Grand Manan to do their banking. So I'm tremendously disappointed in Scotia Bank. It was just a couple of years ago when the government was looking at opening up the banking sector to more competition. Canadian banks told members of Parliament, we're important because we'll respect small communities. But this closure doesn't make any sense. I've written to the agency that oversees banking and banking regulation in this country, and what Scotia's doing, they're being very strategic. They're going through the consultation, and there's not a lot that Parliament can do to prevent this, unfortunately. So look, I hope people vote with their wallet, and they find other banking providers. And there's a Royal Bank ATM at the Penfield Irving, for example, which is a lot closer to people that are coming on and off that island than going to St. George's. But it's very disappointing when our Canadian institutions like this ignore small towns. And it's not like another community on the mainland. This is an island. It's an hour and a half to get to. It's not convenient for the public to go to St. George when they have a bank on the island. Scotia's not released any information that they're losing money. Grand Manan is a prosperous fishing community. I don't think that's the problem. I just think it's a head office far away in Toronto that frankly doesn't care, and it's very disappointing.
Now, as we transition into living with COVID, some of the concerns are changing. What are some of the things you're hearing about in the riding right now that are taking on?
Well, I think we're kind of getting back to what are the local priorities, and what are things that are impacting people's lives. So, for example, we just talked about Grand Manan. In St. George, the Canada Post outlet wants to leave their the historic building they've been in on the main street. Council there is opposed to it, so I've been trying to work with the council there to press Canada Post to reconsider or to modernize that building so they can use it. Because I think what's unique about the post office is it's a federal institution that you find in small communities right across the country. It's the institution that flies the Canadian flag, and that people, it becomes part of the community. So, you know, that's one of the issues we're working on here in St. Andrews. I've talked to the mayor both about affordable housing, the question of possibly helping refugees from Ukraine. Deer Island's got an exciting project for high-speed internet. They're trying to work through the federal government. St. Stephen has their exciting basketball initiative, which is just remarkable how much community support that has, not only in St. Stephen and Charlotte County, but increasingly across the country. It's making headlines in the newspapers. I hear it talked about in Toronto. So it's been really exciting. And these are just some of the examples. I mean, there's many municipalities in New Brunswick Southwest, but we're getting back to, I think, solving some of the local challenges and trying to find ways for the federal government to help. So, you know, I'm active with that. I'm looking forward to, and look, I'm pleased the vaccine passport is done, because it's now easy to meet people for coffee. So as we move from the winter into the spring, you know, people like me will be back in communities and seeing people and talking to mayors face to face, and I'm looking forward to that. That's probably the thing I'm most excited about.
Well, you've been great about coming here during the pandemic as
Yes.
well, so I appreciate that, and I hope to see even more of you in the weeks ahead, and I think I will need to as well.
Well, I look forward to updates. There is a lot going on in Parliament. Look, the energy debate is not going to go away. The carbon tax goes up again on April the 1st. This is something that I think at the very least should be frozen. I support repealing it because I think it hurts working families, but I think we need to question now some of our fundamentals. And gas prices is $2 in Vancouver, which happens to have the highest carbon tax in the country. So you can see where this goes. So lots more issues coming, and I'll be happy to come back in a
Thanks so
few
much,
weeks.
John. Thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
My guest today has been MP John Williamson of New Brunswick Southwest. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.